Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 2023 NAAF RFA Webinar Series. I am Gabrielle Butter, the Associate Communications Officer here at NAAF. We're just waiting a few more moments while more people are hopping on. So before we get started, I just wanted to lay out a few things on how to navigate a Zoom webinar. So if you have any questions, we ask that you submit them using the Q&A feature or ask them using the chat box. We will try to answer all of your questions in the time allotted, but if we don't get to your question, we will be updating our FAQ section on the 2023 RFA webpage. We also ask that if you have any additional questions not addressed today, that you will email grants@nativeamericanagriculturefund.org. That is grants@nativeamericanagriculturefund.org. If you experience any technical issues today throughout the meeting, please describe your issue in the chat box or personally message a NAAF staff member. Finally, I would like to thank you all for attending this year's 2023 RFA webinar series. It's so good to see everyone here. And just as a reminder before we get started, we are recording this webinar and we will be emailing out this session to those that have registered, as well as uploading this recording to our 2023 RFA web page on our website. So before we get started, I want to provide a brief introduction of our team members speaking to you all today. First, you'll be hearing from Tony Stanger-McLaughlin, CEO of NAAF, then Graham Gaither, our grants manager, who will be covering compliance and the RFA application, and our program team members, Chanel Ford, Director of Programs, and Belton Moore, our programs officer, who will be facilitating the Q&A. Without further ado, I'll pass it on to you, Tony.
Thank you, Gabby, and welcome everyone who is joining us today. We are going to have this available. We have a number of webinars every year when we launch our annual grant funding cycle. We are recording today, and this portion of the webinar will be replayed for the next few webinars, but we leave the end of each webinar is live, and that's live Q&A where we will participate and answer your questions in real time. And then those will be archived and available for you moving forward. So today I'm going to start by introducing myself. Tilhas Isquinchuten Sutitqua. Hello, my name is Water Runs Downhill. My English name is Tony Stanger-McLaughlin, and I'm a member of the Colville Confederated Tribe, calling in from my traditional homelands in Northeast Washington State. Again, welcome. We will start off by giving you an introduction to Keepsigal v. Vilsack and explaining how that case was started and how that created NAAF and the previous funding cycles that we've had. So I'm going to start by talking about the Keepsigal v. Vilsack class action. So this class action, the Keepsigal v. Vilsack case was based on discrimination against Native American farmers and ranchers that attempted to get loans from USDA or receive loans and had poor loan servicing. They formed their class with similar farmers and ranchers across the country that had experienced these similar issues under violations of the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And during the Obama administration, Secretary Vilsack, who is our Secretary of the Department of Agriculture again, was in his first administration, and they had an effort to close out for other class action lawsuits that were going on at the same time, our actions. That was the Pigford Black farmer cases, Love, which was female farmer cases, Garcia, which was Hispanic farmers, and Keepsigal. All of those classes had one thing in common. They used the same claims administrator, and you had two options to apply in that process, track A and track B. And there's some confusion regarding the difference between adjudication or judgment and a settlement. In this case, USDA agreed to enter into settlement. They did not admit fault, but they agreed to enter into settlement, the settlement process with all of these classes. The Keepsigal v. Vilsack class, actually, the first claim that was ever processed was filed in 1979. The Keepsigal settlement didn't occur until April 28th of 2011. And for 20 years, many of the class representatives and their class counsel worked tirelessly on this. And ultimately, they were able to get from the department an award of $680 million in damages. Those went to thousands of claimants. There were 3,600 in total, but it wasn't enough to exhaust the amount. Those claims that were filed by individuals were between those individuals and the department itself. It wasn't to the whole 680 million. Again, it was for track A and track B, which meant you were either receiving 50,000 or up to 250,000. And beyond the settlement agreement, there were other things that USDA was promised to do as a result of this class action. And that included debt forgiveness up to $80 million. And for some producers, that was the most important part. They wanted their land free and clear, and the debt forgiveness provided that. And sometimes the debt forgiveness for a few claimants was in the millions. The settlement provided that all the unclaimed funds would be distributed to nonprofits. That was the original, what's called a CyPRE agreement, to hold over the leftover funding to go towards eliminating or reducing the original harms of the original claimants. In this case, that was production agriculture related, and that's what we often focus on here at NAAF, because our job is to, again, reduce or eliminate those original harms. So we do everything we can to provide access to capital and make sure that our producers understand proper loan servicing, and we work with the Department of Agriculture to make sure that this happens too. So ultimately, after the claims process had occurred and the original settlement was unpractical, they came up with an alternative or a second variation of the CyPRE agreement, which allowed for the establishment of NAAF, the Native American Agriculture Fund. But prior to NAAF's starting date, another process occurred, and that's called fast track. And some of you might be fast track grantees. The fast track process occurred when $38 million was distributed immediately to entities that are serving or supporting Native American farmers and ranchers. Again, that occurred prior to NAAF's establishment, but we continue to monitor and support a lot of those fast track grantees, and some of them have become NAAF grantees. We were ultimately awarded the ability to stand up NAAF in 2018, and within a few months of that, we distributed or announced our first funding cycle. And then shortly after, we entered into our second funding cycle. We're now entering year 5. When NAAF was established, it was established with $266 million and a 20-year period to distribute those funds. During that 20-year period, we have 4 eligible entities that we'll talk about a little bit later in the slides. But first, I want to talk about why it's important and why Indian country agriculture is important. We now have participation in the agricultural census. That occurs every few years. It's just like a normal census that you would participate in as a citizen. And it's important because it plays a role in how much money is allocated to Indian country. And in this instance, we want to make sure that Indian country has a significant representation. And we know that it isn't where it needs to be, but we go back to the most recent census data, which is 2017. And through that information, we know that there are close to 80,000 producers that signed up for the last agricultural census and identified themselves as American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiian. We have close to, and we think this is well under what actually is in control of Indian country, and that's 59 million acres in agricultural production and over $3.5 billion in agricultural sales alone. In Arizona, the number of those that register as producers and in the state itself, 52% of them identify as Native American. They actually hold the majority in the state of Arizona. So knowing that type of information is important, again, because it plays a role in how USDA engages with you from the state perspective to the county perspective. So we encourage you to participate in that. But next slide, please. Now we'll move into talking a little bit more about our process. So our mission is to support. And I'm going to read these because some people are calling in and they're not going to see the screen. So to provide business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, and advocacy services to Native American farmers and ranchers, and to support and promote their continued engagement in agriculture. Next slide. From our first funding cycle in 2019 to where we're at now, moving into 2023, we're in multiple states. I think we're up to 27 different states that we have granted to. Here is a little snapshot of some of that data in a graphic and map form. So in Arizona, we have had 17 grantees. In Montana, we've had 15 grantees. In Arizona, we're over 19,000 Native American producers, where we want to make sure that we're catering to where our producers exist, but we also want to make sure we're touching anywhere where a Native American producer our Native American agriculture can be supported. So right now we have a concentrated effort in a number of states that have received funding, and we're hoping to expand that this year. And again, going back to our census data, in New Mexico and Arizona alone, there's close to 30,000 Native producers. Next slide. So we have 4 eligible entities. Everything we do and the ability that we have to administer these funds, and we are fiduciaries to this funding. It goes through our trust agreement, and our trust agreement outlines our eligible entities. Those are 501c3 organizations, educational organizations, including primary grades through college level, and our TCUs, our tribal colleges, community development financial institutions, abbreviation for that is CDFIs, and those are lending entities that often exist in credit deserts, and there are state CDFIs and native CDFIs, and we fund all of these entities, including tribal governments and state tribal governments. And for all the other entities besides tribes, we do look at where the funding's going. We have strict limits on who we can fund. We can't fund individuals. We can fund these entities and they can fund individuals. But NAAF is prohibited from funding individuals. But we also look at Native, the amount of Natives that you're going to serve, but also within your organization. We are a private philanthropic trust fund. We operate as a trust. We are not operated through a tribal government. We are not operated through a federal entity or the BIA. We don't legally we're not bound to tribal preference, but we operate to support entities that are going to concentrate their efforts to stand Indian country up, including Indian country individuals in these organizations or entities. And all of these entities must support Native producers. That is where the money has to go, and you have to prove that at the end. We get audited annually. So when we ask you for this information, it's because we have to be accountable to it, and ultimately accountable to those original claimants. And the work that we do and the mission we have incorporates all of that through these eligible entities, and making sure that we are all being good stewards of this funding. Next slide. So again, I'm going to read this slide. This is about fiscal sponsors. Utilizing a fiscal sponsor is part of NAAF that we have had since inception, and it's been exercised a number of times. But I'm going to read this little slide blip about using a fiscal sponsor or being a fiscal sponsor, and then I'm going to add a few examples. So NAAF encourages startup nonprofit organizations that have applied for 501c3 status from the IRS, but have not yet received a favorable determination, to apply through a fiscal sponsor who can also provide important technical support for proposed project activities. If fiscal sponsors are used, the fiscal sponsor must be an eligible 501c3 organization and should follow the guidance in NAAF's fiscal sponsor information. Note, the relationship between grantees and fiscal sponsors is not managed by NAAF and is the sole responsibility of the grantee. So we, again, have used this a few times. It's been really important for entities that are starting or that look at NAAF and the opportunities that exist to serve their community and decide they want to create a 501c3 to complement that work, or they want to add to what their community already is doing with NAAF. For instance, if your tribal government applies, they can apply for a pool of funding within NAAF's annual RFA, and then a 501 can come in and also apply for funding to support the same community. And oftentimes those projects can correlate or serve the same community, but they also have to be able to survive if one doesn't get funding and the other does. So if there's a project for a production facility, maybe part of it is the feasibility funding and the other part of it might be for some infrastructure development. So just making sure that you understand that in our RFA process. I'm going to give some cautionary notes. If you want to seek out a fiscal sponsor, please make sure that you are very clear with that fiscal sponsor, what their role is, what your role is, how money will be distributed, who will be the main point of contact with NAAF, and communicate amongst each other. We have had some issues where fiscal sponsors they're not communicating with the grantee or vice versa. And then one or the other will come to us and say either nothing's happening or I'm not getting paid. And that is not the responsibility of NAAF. You have to prove to us in your application that you have set those boundaries with your fiscal sponsor. And we need a letter from that fiscal sponsor saying they agree to the requirements that they will have to be imposed upon as the fiscal sponsor. Again, that we are fiscal fiduciaries of this funds. And so we have to make sure that those relationships are going to be successful. But this is a wonderful opportunity for you to use once. So you can apply once while you're trying to receive your nonprofit status. There is potential for you to use it for 2 funding cycles if it's a very complicated process for you to seek out your nonprofit status with the IRS. But this is a temporary fix for you to then become your own eligible entity. You can't use a fiscal sponsor for multiple years. It's very clear in our trust agreement that you have to have applied for your own 501c3 status in order to use an entity that's already secured theirs. Next slide. So a brief overview of our RFA. We're going to go over these in more detail, but the allowable use of funds, collaborators, cooperators, and leveraging unallowable use of funds, addressing access to capital, limitations and indirect costs, initial review on eligibility, cost sharing or matching funds, eligibility of previous grantees. So we'll talk about this more in detail, but this is also housed within our version of our RFA that you can locate on our website. You can download a Word version of all the questions and related materials that will be within the online portal that we use. We use a company called Foundant, and when you log on, you'll have a page that has a little bit of a warning notice on the side. And it's basically saying before you get in and create a profile in Foundant, make sure that you are intending to apply, because ultimately if you decide to abandon your application, those numbers get skewed, and we actually go back in and we look and we want to know, why did you not finish your application? Is there something that we didn't do that we can do better in the future? So please, just as a cautionary note on that too, read the version on our website, the PDF version, the Word version. If you have any further questions on knowing what's in there before you get in and start the application process, again, you can contact us through our contact page, and we'll have more of that at the end of this presentation. Next slide. So we're going to start with access to capital, and I've already touched on this a little bit. So that's a core component of the Keep Siegel case. So access to capital was at the core of the Keep Siegel case. A conversation on access to capital is available on our website. Applications that don't address access to capital will not be funded in 2023. So now that I've read that slide, I'm going to go back and explain a little bit more. Again, the original claimants were certified as a class action by their combined similar impacts that they were, or discrimination that they were receiving, are experiencing. And those were all related to not being able to get loans from what was the Farm and Home Administration and ultimately became the Farm Credit Administration. It was if they got a loan, then they were had discriminatory practices where they didn't get their payments on time, where they were forced into instances and labeled to where their only opportunity was foreclosure or some type of expedited sale. These types of similar experiences are what created the Keep Siegel class. So in order for us to make sure that that doesn't happen again, NAAF has to incorporate access to capital, which is a broad term. And there's so many ways that you can accomplish that within your application. But ultimately, we want to make sure that a Native American or Indian country is informed on everything related to access to capital, so that when they go in for an application today, you're not going to be denied because your credit score, because we have entities that are going to help you learn about your credit score, improve your credit score. You're not going to be denied because you didn't know what the application was asking you, or the timelines. We're working with other entities, and actually one of those entities had a webinar earlier today, the Intertribal Agriculture Council. Occupaton is a CDFI that's doing webinars in this area. But I'm going to give you a few examples of how some of our diverse groups have been able to include access to capital. So again, this is about education. It's about access to capital. It's about getting our producers to a place where they can go to any lending entity and get funding. They're not just able to access from a BIA fund or their tribal credit union, or what USDA used to be called was the lender of last resort, because you had to have been denied by 3 other lending entities before you could receive farm service funding. And we want to change that narrative. And so one example that I use often, and you might have heard me say it before, we had a project in California with youth that had acorns are traditional food for that tribe. And the youth, this elementary school program, wanted to create acorn bites. And in order to add the access to capital to that, they were teaching these young students, what is the cost of harvesting? What is the cost of production of all the other materials that go into creating that acorn bite? And learning about the business side of it, the money side of it. That's how they incorporated access to capital. We have tribal colleges that are creating agricultural degree programs. And in those degree programs, they are including information about credit, about understanding risk and business loans. And that is a way that they're incorporating access to capital. And then we have our CDFIs, which it's a little easier for CDFIs because their work's based on access to capital. They're either receiving funding from NAAF because they want to educate their staff on how they can do agricultural lending, or they're out there doing lending. And we have a really successful CDFI group that we funded in the past. Over the years, they've given out millions of dollars in loans and grants to Native American producers. So those are just some examples on how you can embed that in your application, but I'm going to give you a warning. That is a box you need to check in the application process. If you check, no, I'm not going to provide access to capital, then you do not get to move on in the application process. There is a link to who you can contact to discuss it in the application. And again, we can, to a limited extent, walk you through what that might look like in your project, but it's up to you to make sure that you check that box, and then that is within your project deliverables. You can't just be a statement that, yeah, we want to. We need to see how you're going to do it. And then we also need to see, where does that align within the budget template that we provide that you need to fill out, so that it's not just somebody saying they're going to be doing something. It's they're saying they're going to do it. This is how they're going to do it. This is how much of the budget it's going to cost. It doesn't have to be in the budget, but it has to be explained into the project deliverables, because we need to make sure when we go back and do your quarterly or annual reporting, you did provide access to capital in one manner or another. Next slide. So targeted projects, 501c3. So we call it processes. So in our grant software system, when we say process, that's what we're talking about. That's when we're talking about our current grant cycle. So we have, for the past few years, we've launched on April 1st. This next year, we're likely going to launch a month early. So stay tuned. We'll make that announcement early next year. But during that time, we have general funding and we have youth funding. And within our funding, we have targeted areas, and then we have some special areas that change, usually 4 of them that change. There are opportunities for you to apply. They vary on who can apply for those special areas, but we're going to talk about the targeted areas first. And those targeted areas are by eligible entity type. And so the first one is 501c3 organizations. So a little bit about the targeted area, and I'll read these slides again for those that are calling in. General focus, business assistance, agricultural education, technical support, and our advocacy services. And the special focus for eligible 501c3s includes inflation assistance, supply chain relief, helping stand up tribal departments of agriculture, our market access, and the available pool of funds this year. We have $2 million allocated, and the application has also a base and a cap for all of our all of the parts of our RFA. So the pool is $2 million. The minimum that you can apply for is $150,000, and the maximum is $200,000. Next slide. The next one is educational organizations. So this general focus is business assistance, again, ag education, technical support, our advocacy services, and our special focuses that educational organizations are eligible for this year are infrastructure, and that's for tribal colleges only, and market access. The available pool, but the minimum is $150,000 and the maximum is $200,000, but that also has $2 million. Next slide. Educational organization reminders. So a lot of the terms that we use are broad, and if you think you don't fit, reach out to us and we can help you make those determinations. So educational organizations, broad definition covers all of those under section 170B, IA2 of the IRS code, including K through 12 and post-secondary institutions such as tribal colleges and universities. You'll hear me say TCUs, and that's what I'm referring to. Native American serving non-tribal institutions, and those are institutions that have a high number of Native American students or were founded on serving Native students, but are not defined as a tribal college. Other institutions must have a history and experience serving Native farmers and ranchers. So we have funded universities, we've funded land grants, which are a designation from the United States Department of Agriculture, but and TCUs are also included in that. They are what's called 1994 land grants, but we fund all types of educational institutions, including tribally run BIA schools. And if you have a question on if your entity is eligible, please let us know. Further recommendations in being an eligible educational organization entity is that when your project engages extension, we need to know that tribal extension agents are agents serving a tribal community are the primary leads on that grant application where possible. We've had some projects where they're going to do tribal extension, but then when the money and the budget that we look at, it's going to a department. Or we had one project that it was supposed to be serving one community in one state, and the college applying was in another state, and it ended up being a big field trip for an anthropology class, and it didn't relate to supporting Native farmers and ranchers. So we look at those details in your application, in your project. And again, we have a lot of Q&A moving forward before we close. Use that time to ask these types of questions, but you can also email our general inbox. Next slide. So targeted projects for CDFIs, again, our general focus area for CDFIs is similar, but a little bit different. It's loan, capital, re-granting capital, technical assistance, and business assistance. Their special focus that they're eligible for this year include inflation assistance, supply chain relief, and market access. The pool for CDFIs is always larger because they're providing direct funding to native producers, and their pool is 4 million this year. They have no minimum, but you cannot request the full 4 million. So we have some CDFIs that are doing that. We have one that has $11 million of outstanding loan requests right now. They could eat up that 4 million just in their entity alone. But again, we ask for you to seek out funding that aligns with what the pool is and what you can administer during our period, which is 12, 18, or 24 months. Next slide. Targeted projects for tribes. So you'll notice in our trust agreement that there are a lot more rules associated with tribes compared to the other entities. And that's because when the settlement was being created, they were looking at eligible entities that had some external annual accounting that they would have to provide either to the Department of Treasury for our CDFIs or the IRS for our 501c3s. There isn't a body like that for tribes. And so they tried to include some of those safety nets within our trust agreement language to make sure that the funding that goes to tribes is also going to be accountable and it's going to be vetted accordingly. So you'll notice that it's not because they don't think tribes can do anything right. It's because there's no body that's overseeing an annual budget of a tribe. Oftentimes tribes do because they receive federal funding and they have annual audits, etc. But this was something that the court came up with and we were stuck with. And one of those things, and we'll talk about it later, includes a limited waiver of sovereign immunity. It's not something that I would have included if I had the authority to do this, because waivers are important to tribes and sovereignty itself, but also it's a burden for many tribes. But nonetheless, we'll read what they're eligible for this year in our targeted projects. And the general focus for tribes is business assistance, ag education, technical support, and our advocacy services. Their special focus this year includes agricultural infrastructure, inflation assistance, supply chain relief, tribal department, helping to stand up tribal departments of ag. Their pool is $2 million, again, with a minimum of 150 and a max request of 200,000. Next slide. Instrumentalities. Instrumentalities of tribes are state federally recognized can mean any number of things. Tribal governments have the latitude to determine which entities are instrumentalities of their government. NAAF only needs proper documentation of the status. If an organization wishes to be considered as an instrumentality of a tribal government, the organization must secure and submit any authorizing documents from their tribal government or from the BIA to the specific effect. A statement from the organization other than a tribal government will not suffice for this purpose. So there is a federal register annually that provides for all of the federally and state recognized tribes. You can point us to that. You can, but if you want to be an instrumentality of a tribe, and I'll use an example of a Section 17 corporation where your entity has the authority to make binding decisions on behalf of the tribal government without having to go through every decision with a resolution from the tribal governing body itself. This is a process that you have to go through, and it used to have to be approved by the assistant secretary. Some of these decisions can now be made regionally, and there's different forms of Section 17 corporations or subsidiaries under the Section 17 corporations that can exist. It is not my job to find out if your Section 17 is valid. You need to prove that in the application. If you cannot prove that in the application with the appropriate documents, and we provide you with some examples, then we cannot process your application because we don't know that you're an eligible entity. So just make sure that you have that information prior to closing out your application. You can ask us ahead of time and say, this is the resolution that I have, or here's the document we have from the BIA that proves that we are this type of corporation or this type of entity. But don't wait until June 1st to ask us that. We're going to get a ton of applications and a ton of questions leading up to that. This is an eligibility question that should be at the forward part of your application. So reach out to us as soon as possible. But again, if you're stating that you're a Section 17 corporation, then if you are representing a number of tribes, an entity that represents, here in the Northwest, we have a few examples. One that's in my neighborhood here in Spokane, Washington, is UCUT. And that entity represents a number of tribes that have a stake or an interest in the upper Columbia River. And for them, they have a different type of status to represent all the tribes within that region. But that status had to, when they apply for our funding, their status has to include that document, but also the resolution, because oftentimes in order to become an instrumentality, if you are an instrumentality of multiple tribes, one of the tribes has to stand up and pass a resolution to forward your application on to create the instrumentality. So we need that document too, the founding documents of your entity. And then in some instances, we get an updated resolution from the tribe saying that, yes, this is an entity that exists. They can apply on our behalf. But that's the type, any information on instrumentalities, reach out to us. Next slide. So an important reminder, and I already touched on it earlier, and that is limited waivers of sovereign immunity. They are required. It's in our trust agreement. There's no exceptions. And unfortunately, some tribes do not allow for that. It's in their constitution or their founding, some type of founding resolution or statute within the tribe or code that says we will not waive our immunity. In that instance, the tribe cannot apply. And again, this is not something we wanted to impose on tribes. This is what the court agreed to in the settlement process, the Department of Justice representing the Department of Agriculture. We can help you. We have examples, we have model language. We are willing to get on a phone call with your council, with your general council of your tribe and your tribal government to explain this process. A limited waiver of sovereign immunity is only for the amount you receive. So in this instance, it will be limited to $150,000 to $200,000 for that grant period. If the grant ends earlier, if the tribe finishes their project in 1 year when they had proposed to finish in 2 years, as soon as that final report is done, any part of that limited waiver ends at that time. So it's when the money is spent and the project is closed. So it's only for up to 24 months that limited waiver is valid. So if you have any questions on limited waivers, we have a video, we have materials, reach out to us and we can help. But know that if your tribe only votes on issues such as limited waivers at a certain meeting during a year, let us know that in the application, because that could impact your ability to accomplish your goals within the time that you prescribe. So some tribal governments only meet quarterly. And so you have to plan ahead and get that sovereign immunity waiver on the docket ahead of time, or ask your legal counsel to try to orchestrate signature outside of a general meeting. So just keep that in mind, because timeliness is important. And the other thing we flag, because tribes are the only ones who can apply for this type of funding, is industrial hemp. We only fund industrial hemp projects, and we only fund feasibility or market studies. We don't at this time fund anything related to THC or CBD. We don't fund shovel to the ground at this point. And that's because these policies and procedures are still in their infancy, and there is a lot of risk and a lot of legal work that needs to be done in order for a tribe to engage in hemp production. And so just to, again, be good stewards of NAAF's funding until these laws, codes, and the regulations within the Department of Agriculture have been more formalized, we just at this point are only funding feasibility, but those can be significant. We have one tribe in Montana who utilized an earlier Farm Bill authorization to engage in industrial hemp. They have been growing for a while now, and they're looking at what they can do with that. And they want to create they see that a lot of municipalities are banning single-use plastics. So they're looking at a more environmentally friendly alternative, which is creating plastic or hemp forks, spoons, plates, and they want to go to production. And so we help with their feasibility, and now they're shovel to the ground ready. But because of our funding, they're able to look at other funders and look at other lending with a plan to go ahead. Next slide. All right, I'm now going to hand off youth programming to Graham Gaither.
Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Gaither. I am a grants manager here with the Native American Agriculture Fund. And so I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what I'll be talking about, which is discussing a bit about our youth programming, then going over some evaluation criteria, considerations from the application, and then talking about how to actually access the application using our Foundant grants management platform. So first and foremost, this is youth programming. Within our Foundant system, this is a separate application, but it is on the same timeline as our general applications, which is where you get your targeted funding and special focus funding. And so youth programming has a bit different of an application. You are eligible to apply for both youth and general programming. That's for new grantees as well as returning grantees. And so it is open to all eligible entity types. And the funding has a minimum of $20,000 and a maximum of $200,000, which with a maximum amount available of $1 million. And so that is already open. That opened on April 1st, and it will be closing at the same time as our general process, which closes June 1st. Now, to talk about the evaluation criteria, we have these criteria available on the screen, and I'll go ahead and read them out as well. And each of them has a different weighting because each of them has a different amount of impact on the project success. So first and foremost is the impact on access to capital. As Tony said, NAAF will not fund projects that do not address access to capital. We address that several times in the application through a variety of text responses, a button that says, is your project going to impact access to capital? And so that is one of the major parts of the evaluation as well, and that has a weight of 25%. Next is proposed results and outcomes. Any project that is going to really make a difference in access to capital will also need to be able to demonstrate how it's going to work. And so we highly recommend that you put a lot of work into demonstrating and discussing your proposed results and outcomes. And that also has a weight of 25%. Next is farmer and rancher demand with a weight of 20%. And we highly recommend that applicants discuss not only what the farmers and ranchers of that area need, but also cite data and use tables, use any kind of visual representation that you can, especially data from USDA NAAS. Then we have team and organizational capacity and collaborators. That is a weighting of 10%. We recommend that applicants discuss the qualifications of the team, of the people they're collaborating with, but also in discussing how those qualifications are going to lead to the impacts and proposed results. We have evaluation, that's a weighting of 10%. So we recommend that people discuss not only how you plan to evaluate the results of your project, but also in how that evaluation will further any future programming that you do, especially if you plan on applying with NAAF again. And then finally, innovation and replicability with a weight of 10%. We understand that not every single project is going to be this most incredibly innovative project ever, or one that is necessarily replicable because it might be a project that is specific to your area. But we recommend that you think about that, and we do give weighting towards projects and applicants that have that as part of their discussion. But if you are able to make a part of your project something that is innovative or replicable, something that the rest of your community or tribes outside of your community, something that they can use as a template, that is a fantastic use of resources because we're not reinventing the wheel. So just please include that as a part of your discussion. We're going to go over just a few components of the application process. These are things that you'll see in the application itself, and then some considerations after that. So as I mentioned, outcome and results-based projects, we evaluate projects based on realistic and measurable outcomes and results. So be sure to make that a major part of your application and discuss how those measurable and realistic results will impact access to capital. Speaking of access to capital, this is central to addressing the harms experienced by keepsake claimants. So we recommend tying everything back into access to capital. That's your narrative, your objectives, your budget narrative, cover letter. Everything tying back to access to capital will give your project a very strong foundation. Also, speaking on the budget and budget narrative, it is required that all applicants use NAAF's provided templates. And so we provide templates, samples, both on the website and within the application itself. So if you are ever confused about where to access those items, they are available in multiple different arenas. But if you ever really need something emailed to you, then you can also email grants at Native American Agriculture Fund, and they'll be able to send you any documentation you need and help explain how to use it. Part of that budget is a grantee convening, an in-person grantee convening. And that is where we have grantees come together and meet one another. It is really great for being able to meet your other project partners, people in your cohort, so to speak, and helps build connections and find out what other folks around the country are doing. NAAF does require that all applicants place $1,000 in their budget upload to send one staff member to that in-person convening. NAAF covers hotel and meals, but actually getting the airfare there, that is for what that $1,000 is for. And note that we do build that into our budget samples, our budget templates. So there's no need for you to remember to have to put it in. It's already built into all of our required documentation. Intermediary funds. Intermediary funds represent items like loans, re-grants, scholarships, funds that you intend to give out to other folks. And so NAAF will ask about what you intend to do with those loans, scholarships, and re-grants, but also your history with those items. Have you given them out before? If so, what is your process? How many do you intend to give out and at what amount? So remember to tie all of that back into your organization's proposed results, how you want to impact access to capital, but also how your organization has handled those items before. We also have resume of key personnel. As mentioned before, this is part of your qualifications, your proposed team and collaborators. So discuss how those qualifications and how those organizations you will be collaborating with how do those tie back into your proposed results? What makes your team uniquely qualified to make that project happen? Cover letters. Cover letters should be from a senior official associated with your organization, the applicant organization, and should include the leadership's commitment to the project and how the work fits into the organization overall. And then finally on this slide is support letters. And note that support letters, also known as letters of support, these are optional uploads, but they can help add additional information and context about the community that you are serving or the other organizations that you're going to be working with. Now, we also have just some additional considerations. So one is process reporting, progress reporting, and compliance. So this is especially important for returning grantees, but NAAF does consider the timeliness of reporting, specifically for major reports like annual and final reports when evaluating your projects. So this is especially important for returning grantees, but also new grantees. Please do keep this in mind. We also have confidentiality and conflict of interest. So NAAF evaluators and employees sign binding confidentiality agreements and forms indicating our conflict of interest. So evaluations are set up from the foundation, from the ground up, to be neutral, to give your evaluation the neutrality that it needs so that we are evaluating the project for its contents. And then unsuccessful applicants. Please know that any applicants that are not selected for funding can opt to meet with a NAAF team member to discuss areas that can be strengthened for future applications. That is a process that you have to voluntarily get into. So we're not going to call you and say, hey, please let us know when you can meet with us. It's something that we ask any applicants that were not funded to go ahead and contact us, and we'll give you all of that information once evaluations have been completed. Some budget notes. NAAF's indirect cost limit is 15%. There are no exceptions to that maximum. You can do under 15%. That's totally okay. But unfortunately, even if your organization's or tribe's indirect limit is higher, NAAF, all grants must be a maximum of 15%. As mentioned before, applicants must also upload our provided budget templates, and we request that you use our budget guidelines. And all of that information is located both on our website and in the application itself. We also ask that all requests follow the maximums and minimums provided in the RFA overview. So here we see our critical deadlines. As mentioned, both the youth and the general processes or grant funding opportunities will close June 1st at effectively midnight, 11:59 p.m. We highly recommend that you turn in your application earlier than that, because there could be heavy traffic from lots of folks turning in their application, technical issues. And so we highly recommend that you begin submission early. We also want to remind that there is no opportunity to edit the application after the deadline. So now we're going to go in a little bit about our application system. NAAF utilizes an application system called Founded. It's a grants management system. And this is where you do everything related to your grant funded project. This is where you apply, where you come in to get your grant agreement when it's ready, where you would submit your quarterly updates, annual reports, final reports, all that good stuff. Everything happens in this one system. And so it's vital to keep this bookmarked, especially if you become a grantee. So we'll go in a little bit about the login page, which is not generally the most exciting thing, but there is some important considerations to have here. So if you are a returning applicant or an existing grantee, then you'll log in with your same credentials, same login, same password that you've used before. If you do not have your information or you don't remember it, then we do have a forgot password button, and you can use that to get your username and password. We ask that you do not create a new username if you can't remember your information, because then it's going to ask you to create a new organization, which could create duplicate organizations. It can get messy fairly quickly. So if you don't remember your info, please work with us and use that forgot password function. And you can also contact grants at Native American Agriculture Fund, and they'll be able to help you with any technical issues related to your password as well. If you are a new applicant or a new user, then you will press Create New Account. And this is especially useful if your organization has not applied with a grant with NAAF before. Now, there are also folks that are new users, but their organization is not new. They might be an existing grantee or they've applied before. And in that special use case, we ask that you contact grants at nativeamericanagriculturefund.org, and they'll be able to walk you through the process of creating a new account for you and linking it to that organization that's already worked with or applied for a NAAF grant. It's the most exciting stuff, isn't it? So next we have our Applicant Dashboard. This is the first thing that you will see once you have logged into your account. And this is where you can go back in to access your application as you continue to work on it. The application will save every 100 characters. So it saves very frequently, automatically, but it also has a manual save button. And once you save manually, you will come back to this screen. So you can always come back in here and go back to your application to continue working on it. And if you are an existing grantee with us, this is where you would access forms like your grant agreement, your annual report, final report, etc. This is your landing board, so to speak. You'll also notice that at the top, especially if you don't have any existing applications, you will see a apply button and it will bring up this page. This shows our existing applications, which right now is our 2023 general and 2023 youth. And to apply, you simply click that blue apply button on the top right of whichever opportunity you're interested in. And please note that you can apply for both. Oh, this is what the application itself looks like. And we don't have any extra stuff on this visual that shows you the application itself. But once you've clicked apply, you'll begin that application process and you will go through all of the fields, and some questions are required. Those questions will have an asterisk on them, and some are optional. The most important consideration for this application is that it opens up question groups based on how you answer. So for example, if you click that you are a 501c3 organization, then the questions that pop up will be relevant to 501c3s. And this is to make sure that our applicants are able to see the questions that are most relevant to them. So just something to keep in mind is the way the application looks when you first open it is going to be a bit different because it does respond to how you answer. Note that we do have all of our templates located on the application itself. They are also available on our website or available by contacting grants at Native American Agriculture Fund. Now, I'm going to go ahead and transition it to our Q&A period. So thank you very much for letting me speak. It was great to be here, and I'm going to hand it off to Belton Moore.
Thank you, Graham and Tony. I'm Belton Moore. I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe. I grew up on a farm here in North Carolina, where I still live now, just a couple hours away from the farm. But I've been with NAAF for about 2 years. So this is my second RFA process. really excited to work with you all this year. So as far as Q&A, please feel free to enter your questions into either the chat or the Q&A feature within Zoom. If you can figure that one out, it's a little bit tricky, but we have one question. We have a couple of questions. So I'll start with the most recent one. Our organization has new staff that would be applying for this grant. Can individuals invited to collaborate to work on the application also submit the narrative, agreement, reports, etc.? I believe so, but Graham, can you confirm that they are able to submit? I know you have to choose for the reports and everything for them to be able to submit everything, but as far as the application goes, are they able to submit all those documents?
Yes.
Awesome. Sounds good. Okay, and I know we had one question that was answered already, but I'll go ahead and read that one out just in case you didn't see it. So the question was, how is market access being defined in the context of this project? And so thank you, Sarah, for including the RFA description there. So all of this you can find in our RFA, but always feel free to reach out and ask these questions as well. For this one in particular, it's a new category that we're really excited about. So our work here at NAAF, obviously we serve native producers, so a lot of our work focuses on production, agriculture. But with this market access piece, we're also thinking about how do we help those native farmers and ranchers get their products, their goods, whatever they're growing, whatever they're producing to market. And that can look like a lot of different things. So it can look like more traditional methods of wholesale agriculture, wholesaling your products, or it can look like farmers markets. These projects can focus on marketing, those kinds of things, market analyses, those kinds of projects. So lots of different options for that one, but you can find a list of some suggested projects based on your entity type. And like I said, always feel free to reach out and ask us for clarification if there's something you're unsure about. Are the slides for this presentation available in addition to the recording? I think that we can make that happen, Gabby.
Yes, it'll be available once I get the recording to this presentation online, and you can find that at the bottom of the 2023 RFA webpage.
Yep, thank you. I know this is a lot of information to digest at once. So we'll have several more webinars, as we mentioned. So you can always join those webinars around the hour mark. So we have 2 hours allotted. So the first hour will be the presentation that you all just viewed, and then the second hour will be Q&A. And so we usually get more questions towards the end of the cycle. We understand that. So feel free to join one of those webinars, or really all of the webinars as you work through your application. I'm sure you'll have different questions that come up throughout the process. So always feel free to join multiple webinars. All right. My organization is Native and woman-owned. I'm not quite sure which entity I would qualify under, if any. So we are quite limited with the 4 eligible entity types. So I'm not sure if your organization is a 501c3. You say it's woman-owned. So for-profit organizations, unfortunately, unless they are falling under a tribal government or instrumentality, are not eligible. So again, our eligible entities are 501c3 organizations, or those applying for 501c3 status with the fiscal sponsor, tribal governments and their instrumentalities, and we let those tribes determine which organizations qualify as an instrumentality, CDFIs, community development financial institutions, and educational organizations. But again, feel free to reach out and we will help you determine which, if you do qualify, in which category you would fall under. Next question is there a limit to how many times an organization may receive funding? There is no limit. So we do want to see progress in your work, and we can't fund the same grant project multiple times, but it can be kind of an enhancement, step 2, phase 2 of that project, but we don't have a total limit on how many times we can fund.
One example of that is if you are providing scholarships or internships to students, it's the same project, but they're new students. You can't fund the same students over and over, the same project over and over again. But again, if you have questions on that, reach out to us because we have other projects. We have a project where they phase it, and in their application, they talk about, I'm applying this year and we hope to be ready for phase 2 next year. And then they'll come back and maybe the first one was a feasibility. The second one, they're ready to either hire full-time students, or the curriculum has been established at their school and now they want money to bring in students.
Awesome. Any more questions? It's good to see such a great turnout today. I know at least here in North Carolina, we're having amazing weather. So I'm sure folks could be outside enjoying that weather, but we appreciate you joining us here today.
Thank you very much, Belton. I'll go ahead and take it over. So thank you all so much for joining. Here's our contact information. If you have any additional questions, go ahead and email us at grants@nativeamericanagriculturefund.org or call us at 479-445-6226. And then we also have our upcoming webinars. If you didn't already sign up for those, these are whenever they'll be. The next webinar is going to be solely focused on youth RFA applications for our youth grant. And so if you haven't already registered for them, you can find them on our website on the 2023 RFA page, and they will always be housed there. And then as a final reminder, we will be sending out an email to those that have registered today for the webinar slides and the webinar recording, and then we will also be uploading that to our website. So we look forward to seeing your applications this year.